a gold-covered chest that, according to the stories, could halt a river, topple city walls, and strike a man dead with a single touch. What happened to the Lost Ark of the Covenant? That question sits at the intersection of theology, politics, archaeology, and legend. It's the kind of puzzle that invites both reverent curiosity and careful skepticism. An object described in the Bible with immense religious power, yet one that vanishes from the historical record and spawns a string of competing explanations. In this video, we're going to trace what the biblical texts actually say about the ark's shape and role, walk through the dramatic episodes that built its fearsome reputation, and then step back into the material world, comparing the ark to similar sacred chests and ceremonial boats from Egypt and the Near East. Along the way, I'll point to the main theories about its disappearance and what evidence each actually rests on. If you like history mysteries and grounded scholarship, hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. The sources I draw on are linked in the description. Start with the object itself. The book of Exodus gives us the most concrete, intentionally simple inventory, a rectangular box made of acacia wood overlaid with pure gold, carried on poles passed through rings fixed to its sides. Its measurements are given in cubits. Roughly speaking, the ark is about 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. That translates to a compact chest about the size of a small modern trunk, something you could picture sitting comfortably in the back of a pickup truck, not a massive monument. On top of this chest sits the lid, called in many English translations the mercy seat or propitiatory, a slab of solid gold flanked at either end by two cherubim, winged figures that face each other with wings outstretched, forming a kind of throne or canopy. The poles inserted through the rings were never to be removed. The instructions are explicit, because the ark is not just furniture. It is, as the text insists, the place where God's presence dwells among the Israelites. What, if anything, was inside the ark is where the textual lines split. Exodus describes the ark as the repository for the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, clearly the defining contents in that text. But later authors add layers. A passage in the New Testament letter to Hebrews mentions, somewhat elliptically, that items associated with worship were placed inside the ark, and in later Jewish traditions, the ark is said to have contained a golden jar of manna and Aaron's blossoming staff. These additional claims are not found uniformly across sources. They reflect evolving theological emphases. The primary, earliest anchor in the narrative remains the tablets, the ark as the divine covenant's container and throne. Beyond its physical description, the ark's narrative function is crucial.
It acts as a mobile center of sanctity, the visible sign that God is present with the people. It also functions as a kind of oracle instrument. Decisions, battles, and political claims are made in its name or with it in the field. Its presence can be protective. Its mishandling can be dangerous. These two poles, presence and power, define much of how the ark operates in the biblical stories. Those stories are dramatic, built to impress and to explain how political events intersected with religious meaning. One of the most striking episodes is the crossing of the Jordan. As the Israelites approach the land, the priests carry the ark to the bank of the river. The narrative describes the waters stopping when the priests step into the current. The people cross on dry ground. In the world of the text, the ark functions as the mediating presence, God's seat, that makes possible the crossing. Whether one reads the episode as myth, miracle, or encoded memory of ritual practice, the image is powerful. A box borne by appointed priests that changes the environment around it. Another foundational scene is the fall of Jericho. Joshua's forces march around the city for 7 days, accompanied by priests blowing ram's horns and with the ark following the procession. On the 7th day, after the sound of trumpets and a cry from the people, the walls collapse and the city is taken. The story links military success with sacred ritual, with the ark as the instrument, or at least the symbol, of divine action on behalf of the community. The ark's reputation is not only built by triumphs, it is defined by episodes that reveal its terrifying aspect. Consider the Philistine capture, recounted in the books of Samuel. In a battle that turns disastrously, the ark is taken by the Philistines and installed in the temple of their god, Dagon. The next morning, the statue of Dagon is found prostrate before the ark. It is later damaged, and a string of misfortunes afflict the Philistine cities. Tumors, blood issues, and other calamities are reported. Seeing the ark as a dangerous presence, the Philistines ultimately ship it away from city to city in an attempt to get rid of the affliction. The narrative casts the ark not as a benign relic to be displayed, but as a charged, potent object whose presence could cause sickness, fear, and political crisis. Then there is the episode of Uzzah. When David attempts to bring the ark into Jerusalem, the ark is transported on a cart, because in the interim period, the ritual expertise for transporting it on poles seems not to have been observed. At a particular moment, the oxen stumble, and a man named Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark. The text reports that God struck him down for touching the sacred object. The event is shocking and has been the subject of centuries of theological wrestling. In the narrative frame, it underscores a recurring lesson. The ark is not neutral cargo.
It is holy in a way that requires ritual respect and specified handling. David's later retrieval of the ark, after a period of residence elsewhere, is carried out with great ceremony. The ark is brought to Jerusalem amid music, dancing, and displays of public religion. It is placed first in the house of Obed-Edom, where the household prospers, and then King David intends to place it in a permanent shrine. Solomon, David's son, will later build a temple in which the ark is installed in the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, once the temple is complete. That placement is the culmination of a theological program. The ark is no longer a portable sign. In the centralized cult of the monarchic temple, it becomes the pivot around which national worship revolves. These episodes together create the ark's biography within Israel's story, an object intimately linked to identity, politics, and ritual authority. If we accept, provisionally, for the sake of analysis, that these narratives reflect how ancient people understood sacred objects, then the disappearance of the ark is not just an archaeological puzzle. It is a crisis of legitimating symbols. If the sign of God's presence is gone, what happens to the claims of priesthood and monarchy that rested on it? Before we move into the competing theories of where the ark went, it's important to step back and consider the broader cultural and material world in which a wooden, gold-plated chest and a procession of priests make sense. Objects like the ark did not appear in a vacuum. Across the ancient Near East, divine presence was often localized in a physical object and conveyed in public processions. Two areas of comparison are particularly instructive: Mesopotamian Levantine throne imagery and Egyptian ritual barges. In the royal art of the Assyrians and their neighbors, thrones are often flanked by hybrid creatures, winged bulls, lions with human heads, and other composite beings that function protectively and symbolically. These images recall the cherubim atop the ark's lid, stylized beings that guard the divine seat. The idea of a deity occupying a throne or standing on a platform flanked by mythical guardians is a recurrent motif in the region's visual language. It's not proof that any single motif migrated directly into Israelite imagination, but it situates cherubim in a broader iconographic context where animals and hybrids represent divine power and protection. Mobile sacred seats are attested in a variety of cultures. In some Arabian and Bedouin contexts, for example, portable shrines, sometimes called utfa in later scholarship, serve to embody a tribe's tutelary deity or spirit, carried from place to place in times of war or ceremony. Palanquins and shrine carriers were common. A wooden platform, borne on poles, transport gods during festivals and military movements. The functional parallel is clear, a portable vehicle of presence that both marks and moves sacred authority.
The most compelling parallels, however, come from Egypt. The Egyptians developed a rich cult practice around the sacred bark, a boat-shaped shrine, often richly carved and gilt, in which a god's cult image was carried during festivals and processions. The bark was not merely symbolic, it represented the deity's means of ascending and moving through the world. Texts and reliefs show priests bearing these barks on long poles during processions, navigating both terrestrial routes and mythic waterways. Perhaps the most evocative parallel is the funerary bark, miniature wooden boats placed in tombs, or the ritual bark that carried the image of the sun god across the sky. Materially, these barks could be wooden, layered with gold, and adorned with figurative sculptures. Functionally, they served as mobile thrones and points of contact between deity and people. Consider the visual dynamic: a wooden structure covered with precious metal, carried on poles by a ritual cadre, accompanied by trumpets and priests, forming the center of processional spectacle. In these respects, the ark looks and behaves very much like an Egyptian sacred bark transplanted into Israelite cultic language. That does not necessarily mean the ark is an Egyptian bark, but it suggests cultural resonance. The ancient Levant was a crossroads where iconography and ritual practices circulated. Israelite religion, in its formation, drew on shared Near Eastern tropes, even as it articulated distinctive theological claims, most notably the idea of a single, covenantal God whose presence could be represented by a portable throne. This comparative lens also helps us make sense of the ark's dual identity. It is simultaneously a cultic object and a symbol of national authority. When the Philistines seize the ark, they do not simply loot treasure. They appropriate the symbol of Israelite divine legitimacy. Their misfortunes after keeping it, as the biblical text frames them, are a narrative way of saying you cannot appropriate another people's god safely. The god's presence has its own rules. In the same way, when Babylonian or other imperial forces carried off cult objects from conquered cities, they were not just taking valuables, they were making a political statement. The fate of the Ark, therefore, must be assessed not only as the fate of a wooden chest, but as the fate of a political religious emblem. Archaeology complicates the picture. Material finds that resemble the Ark in size and form exist: small chests, rich wooden boxes, and portable shrines in various museum collections and excavation reports, but none can be identified as the Ark. There is no independent contemporary inscription that names the Ark and ties it to an excavated artifact.
That silence is not proof that the Ark never existed. It is a caution. Absence of evidence is a real constraint in reconstructing the past, especially for a relatively modest wooden object made to be mobile and therefore likely to suffer decay or destruction over centuries. Beyond material parallels, the comparative approach also illuminates how narratives about sacred objects evolved. A portable throne used in rituals can, over generations, accrete mythic power. A chest that once housed treaty tablets or relics of a founding moment can be recast as a living locus of divine agency. Once a religious community has invested the object with stories of miraculous intervention, those stories feed back into political claims. That feedback loop, material object to narrative, narrative to political authority, authority to ritual centralization, is a pattern visible across the ancient Near East, not unique to Israel. So when we ask what happened to the Ark, we must keep multiple categories in mind. There are the textual claims, biblical narratives that place the Ark at central ritual moments and then show it moving, being captured, or being installed in the temple. There is the comparative, archaeological context, similar objects and practices across neighboring cultures that suggest plausible material forms and ritual uses for the Ark. And there are later traditions, stories that develop centuries after the events in question, each carrying its own agenda and cultural location. Treating these categories distinctly is essential if we are to weigh hypotheses responsibly. At this point, we have a clear sense of what the Ark was claimed to be and why it mattered. We have walked through the scenes that forged its reputation and situated it within an environment where cultic chests and sacred boats were familiar. Those steps already narrow the field of plausible fates. If the Ark existed as a portable, wooden, gold-covered container central to cult practice, then common outcomes for such objects in antiquity include deliberate hiding, seizure as war booty, ritual destruction or decommissioning, repurposing, or gradual loss through collapse of institutions and decay. But the story is complicated by the authority that the Ark confers. An occupying power might remove it as a demonstration of conquest. A religious community under threat might hide it to protect the symbol. A later religious imagination might invent a noble or miraculous transfer to maintain continuity of claim. And so we arrive at the textual afterlife of the Ark, how later writers and communities built competing accounts of its disappearance. The biblical narrative itself grows quiet after certain historical moments, and a patchwork of later traditions steps into the silence. Some sources suggest the Ark was taken to Babylon as part of the imperial plunder. Others, writing later and in different cultural contexts, assert that it was hidden in a cave by prophetic figures or by a reforming king. The Ethiopian Christian tradition, elaborated in medieval texts, tells a very different story, in which the Ark leaves Jerusalem for the African highlands, becoming the foundation of a royal and ecclesiastical lineage. Each of these accounts arrives with its own provenance, its own dating, and its own internal logic, and each will require separate scrutiny. But before we examine those claims one by one, a crucial observation needs to be underscored. The archaeological record offers no direct contemporaneous confirmation for any of these outcomes. There is no excavation that produces an inscribed box bearing the words Ark of Yahweh and a chain of custody pointing from the temple precinct to a later repository. That absence forces us to evaluate evidence on different terms. We can test plausibility by asking whether an outcome fits patterns of ancient behavior, how empires treated cult objects, how communities safeguarded their relics, and by interrogating the dates and motives of sources that make claims. We can also ask whether the description of the Ark itself might have been shaped by theological aims, so that the object's value in the story exceeds its material footprint. As we prepare to weigh specific hypotheses, the Ark taken by Babylon, deliberately hidden by Jeremiah or Josiah, spirited off to Ethiopia, or perhaps never existing in the literal form later writers assume, we must keep this triangulation in mind: text, context, and material reality. Each hypothesis will be judged against those three axes. There is one more layer to consider before moving into the traditions: politics. Sacred objects are not just religious tokens, they are instruments of governance. The presence or absence of a cult object can validate institutions. When a king places the Ark in the temple, he is not merely making a religious claim, he is anchoring his dynasty's legitimacy in a visible, storied symbol. Conversely, the loss or concealment of such an object can be a way to delegitimize an incumbent power or to preserve hope for restoration. That explains why when narratives become silent at crucial historical junctures, like the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, later writers often feel compelled to fill the void with a story that preserves the community's claim to continuity and divine favor. Given the stakes, it is perhaps unsurprising that the question, "What happened to the Ark?" yields multiple, even contradictory answers. Some are pragmatic, the Ark was taken as booty. Some are protective, it was hidden to prevent desecration. Some are theological or nationalizing, it was taken to a new remote sanctuary to preserve the covenant. Each answer is as much a reflection of the concerns of the storytellers as it is a claim about physical movement. At the end of this first stretch of the investigation, we have done several things. We've anchored the Ark in the concrete terms of Exodus, size, materials, and ritual handling.
We've traced the famous episodes that made it matter: Jordan, Jericho, Philistine capture, Uzzah, David, and Solomon. And we've used comparative archaeology, especially the Egyptian bark and Near Eastern throne imagery, to show how the art fits into a wider cultural repertoire of portable divine seats. We've also emphasized a methodological point that will carry into the next stage: the need to keep textual claims, archaeological data, and later traditions analytically distinct. The next step is to follow the trail of disappearance claims themselves, the silence left in the wake of the Babylonian conquests, the early accounts that claim the Ark was hidden by prophets, the later Talmudic and apocryphal stories that assert secret caches and miraculous transfers, and the proud Ethiopian narratives that insist the Ark lives on in Aksum. Each of these accounts comes with a set of internal features: who tells it, when and why they tell it, and what material or political evidence supports their version. Some are short on external corroboration but rich in theological meaning. Others fit a plausible pattern of imperial plunder. Sorting among them will require close reading of the sources and careful weighing against archaeological patterns of how cult objects are treated in war and exile. Which of these possibilities best explains the Ark's vanishing act? The answer will not be a firm single verdict, but by tracing the contours of the evidence we can, at least, rank the scenarios by plausibility and say what each account does and does not tell us about ancient memory and authority. Now let's examine the main hypotheses about the Ark's disappearance one by one, weighing what the sources actually claim, when they were written, and how each scenario fits patterns we know from ancient history and archaeology. 1. Taken as war booty by the Babylonians. What the sources say. The historical moment most scholars point to as decisive is the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem and the destruction of Solomon's temple in the late 6th century BCE. Biblical texts describe the removal of temple treasures and the exile of elites. Babylonian policy toward culted cults elsewhere is well attested in imperial practice. Some later writings assume or state explicitly that the Ark was among the spoils, but the earlier Hebrew texts we have do not give a straightforward inventory naming the Ark itself. Provenance and dating. The Babylonian sack is a securely dated historical event, commonly placed in the 580s-570s BCE range in conventional chronology. References to temple plunder appear in biblical books composed or edited in the exile and post-exile periods. Non-biblical Babylonian annals and chronicles document campaigns and tribute, but do not, as far as surviving records show, list an Ark as an item in a way we can tie directly to Jerusalem's cultic furniture.
Why this theory is plausible. Empires routinely seized cult objects as symbolic trophies to demonstrate dominance. Assyrian and Babylonian records and reliefs show triumphal displays and the relocation of divine statues, actions meant to demonstrate that the gods of the vanquished had been humbled or transferred. In that context, the Ark would have been an obvious prize: portable, gold-covered, politically charged, and therefore both valuable and symbolically potent. Weaknesses and limits. There is no explicit contemporary Babylonian inscription that names the Ark. The biblical accounts of the exile emphasize the removal of treasures, but absence of an itemized list that includes the Ark leaves room for doubt. Also, some late traditions insist the Ark was hidden prior to the sack. If those are accurate, the Babylonians would not have captured it. Because wooden objects decay and gold can be melted down for reuse, physical traces are unlikely unless the Ark survived intact in a controlled repository. Bottom line: historically plausible and consistent with imperial behavior, defensible as one of the leading explanations, but lacking a smoking gun piece of epigraphic or archaeological evidence. 2. Hidden by priests, Jeremiah, or a reforming king, the deliberate concealment traditions. What the sources say.
Several later Jewish and Christian writings claim that the Ark was deliberately hidden to prevent its capture. The version preserved in 2nd Maccabees, a deuterocanonical work written in Greek and likely compiled in the 2nd century BCE, tells a story in which Jeremiah conceals the Ark in a cave on Mount Nebo or in an unspecified secret place until a future time when God will reveal it. Other rabbinic traditions, some preserved in Talmudic literature and medieval Jewish commentaries, attribute the hiding to reforming kings, such as Josiah, or to prophetic custodians who wished to protect the cultic symbol. Provenance and dating. These hiding narratives are generally later than the events they describe. 2nd Maccabees is a Hellenistic period text, 2nd century BCE. Talmudic sources and rabbinic traditions crystallize centuries later in late antiquity and the early medieval period. Their late dates mean they reflect memory and theological concerns in communities already wrestling with loss and restoration. Why this theory is plausible. Hiding sacred objects in times of threat is a well-documented ancient response. Portable cultic equipment, precisely because it can be moved, is often concealed to avoid desecration or appropriation. The narrative function is also clear. Telling a story of concealment preserves hope and continuity. If the Ark is hidden, it can be revealed in a time of restoration, sustaining a community's expectation. Weaknesses and limits. The primary problem is temporal distance. The accounts that claim concealment are not contemporary eyewitness records, but later reconstructions with theological aims.
They often serve to explain why the Ark is missing while preserving the idea that the covenantal sign still exists and will return. Without independent archaeological corroboration or contemporaneous testimony, the concealment hypothesis remains attractive but not verifiable. Bottom line. Concealment is historically plausible and explains the silence in early sources, but the evidence for a particular hiding story rests on later texts that must be read as theological memory as well as potential historical report. 3. Taken to Babylon and then lost, destroyed, or repurposed. What the sources say. Some strands of tradition, apocalyptic texts and later commentaries, imply that the Ark left Jerusalem and was taken into exile, only to be lost, destroyed, or perhaps even displayed in a foreign temple. 4th Ezra, also called 2nd Esdras, a late 1st century CE apocalyptic text, and other late writings reflect a world in which many cultic symbols have been dispersed, and where answers about their fate are framed apocalyptically or allegorically. Why this theory is plausible. If the Ark was taken to Babylon, its fate could have been similar to other valuables in imperial hands, melted down for metal, stored in palace treasuries, or displayed briefly as a token of dominance and later forgotten when political fortunes shifted. The practical reality is simple. Gold can be reused, wood decays, and once a cult disappears along with its priests and institutional framework, the meaning of a container like the Ark could be lost even if the object survived physically for a time. Weaknesses and limits. Again, the absence of direct textual confirmation that names the Ark in Babylonian contexts is an obstacle. Moreover, if the Babylonians had used the Ark as a trophy, they might have recorded it in some fashion. The silence does not disprove the scenario, but limits the certainty. Bottom line. This is a specific variant of the taken as booty option, emphasizing subsequent destruction or repurposing. It fits patterns of material reuse and the disappearance of cultic infrastructures, and it is therefore plausible. 4. Spirited away to Ethiopia, the Kebra Nagast tradition. What the sources say. The Ethiopian Christian tradition, most fully articulated in the medieval Kebra Nagast, tells a striking story. Menelik, a son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, takes the Ark from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. Tradition often names Aksum as its resting place. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has long maintained that the Ark of the Covenant resides in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, guarded by a single priest who is said to be its custodian. Access to the purported Ark is restricted, and the Church forbids external examination. Provenance and dating. The Kebra Nagast is a medieval text, compiled long after the monarchic period it describes. It is a rich theological and national epic that constructs a lineage connecting Ethiopian rulers to Solomon, thereby legitimating royal and ecclesiastical authority. The Menelik story functions to embed Judeo-Christian continuity into Ethiopian identity. Why this theory is culturally powerful. For Ethiopian orthodoxy, the claim is foundational. If true, it establishes a direct, unbroken link between Israel's sacred history and Ethiopian Christianity. The tradition has shaped pilgrimage, liturgy, and national memory for centuries, which gives it strong internal coherence and social reality. Weaknesses and limits. From a historical and evidential standpoint, the Ethiopian claim is late and internal to a particular religious narrative. There is no independent archaeological trail linking Jerusalem to Aksum with an identifiable object that can be verified as the Ark. The fact that access to the claimed shrine is restricted means external verification is effectively impossible.
Respectful of those religious practices, scholars must therefore treat the tradition as a potent belief rather than an empirically confirmed fact. Bottom line, the Ethiopian hypothesis is of great cultural significance and cannot be dismissed as mere invention, but as a historical claim, it is late and lacks corroborating archaeological or documentary evidence outside of the tradition itself. 5. Ritual decommissioning, symbolic replacement, or literary construction. What the sources say. Another cluster of scholarly interpretations treats the Ark not primarily as a single recoverable artifact, but as a theological and literary construct that developed as part of Israelite religion and its historiography. From this angle, the Ark's narrative role, its centrality in stories of conquest, disaster, and kingship, serves ideological and liturgical purposes. Some scholars suggest that the stories about the Ark reflect theological claims about God's presence and the centralization of worship, with the physical object functioning as a narrative device, rather than, or in addition to, a persistent, recoverable cultic chest. Why this theory is plausible. Literary development in ancient texts often creates objects and episodes that embody ideas. The Ark, with its oracle function and its association with covenant and kingship, is a powerful symbol that a community can use to tell its own story. If the Ark's material reality was modest or was lost early, narrative elaboration could produce an amplified, theologically charged portrait that suited later authors' needs. Weaknesses and limits. The literary thesis does not deny that some physical object may have existed. Rather, it cautions historians against assuming continuity between a textual description and a single surviving artifact. Additionally, the presence of cultic paraphernalia in archaeology and comparative contexts makes it unlikely that the Ark was purely imaginary.
The better formulation may be that material object and narrative symbol informed and reshaped each other over time. Bottom line, treating the Ark as both material cult object and theological symbol allows us to hold in tension the archaeological silence and the narrative intensity. It's a useful interpretive frame rather than a single historical claim. How do these scenarios stack up? A reasoned ranking. If we assemble these options side by side and ask which best fits patterns of ancient behavior, documentary timing, and material likelihood, a cautious ranking emerges, one that leaves room for uncertainty. Most plausible, hidden locally by priests or prophetic custodians, or taken as imperial booty during the Babylonian conquest. Both outcomes are historically plausible. Concealment explains silence and preserves theological hope, while imperial seizure fits a well-documented pattern of how empires treated enemy cults. The two are not mutually exclusive. Concealment could have happened and failed, or some items could have been hidden while others were captured. Plausible but less certain, the Ark was taken to Babylon and then destroyed, repurposed, or simply lost to the vagaries of history. This scenario explains disappearance by routine processes: melting gold, reusing wood, loss of institutional memory. Possible but historically thin, transfer to Ethiopia. The tradition is powerful and ancient in its own context, but it is late and functionally more theological and nationalizing than documentary. Without external evidence, its historical claim remains contested. Interpretive alternative to consider: the Ark as a narrative theological construct layered onto an earlier cultic object. This is not an either-or with material explanations. It is a methodological reminder that textual amplification can produce a potent symbol that outlived its physical referent. What would count as decisive evidence? Scholars would change their assessments if a contemporaneous, independently datable inscription or archaeological deposit securely linked an identifiable archaeological object to Jerusalem cult and its custody. For instance, a labeled chest buried in a securely dated Judean context with corroborating texts would be transformative. Short of that, the most we can do is triangulate. Match literary claims to patterns of imperial behavior, assess the internal histories of the traditions that claim concealment or transfer, and use comparative material culture to ground expectations about size, form, and ritual use. Why the lack of direct evidence is not surprising. The Ark, if it existed as described, was precisely the kind of object subject to loss. It was portable and therefore vulnerable in times of collapse. It contained perishable wood that could rot away. Its gold could be stripped and melted, and its religious function depended on an institutional framework, priests, a temple, that was disrupted by exile and conquest. Add to that centuries of reuse and upheaval in the Levant, and the archaeological invisibility of many wooden objects becomes understandable. Beyond the question of provenance, meaning, and memory. One point returns us to the larger question posed by the title: what happened to the Lost Ark of the Covenant? The honest answer: based on the evidence we have, is that we cannot say with certainty where the Ark ended up. What we can say with more confidence is what the disappearance has meant in history and imagination. The Ark's vanishing act created a space where communities could project hope, claim continuity, or craft legitimation. For Jews in exile and after, stories of hidden treasures or of a future return functioned as theological ballast. For imperial powers, capturing cult objects was a performance of domination. For Ethiopian Christians, the claim of custodianship establishes a distinctive religious identity that links Ethiopia to the biblical past. And for scholars and enthusiasts today, the Ark is a prism through which issues of archaeology, textual transmission, material culture, and memory all converge. Methodologically, the Ark episode is a reminder to distinguish three registers: the claims of the ancient texts, the comparative and archaeological context that helps us imagine what a plausible cultic object might have looked like and how it would behave in history, and the layers of later tradition that answer the silence left by the disappearance. Each register has its own evidentiary standards and explanatory purposes. A closing synthesis. If I had to offer a short, balanced verdict, the most historically plausible scenarios are either that the Ark was hidden by custodians to protect it, or that it was seized during the tumult of conquest and subsequently lost, repurposed, or destroyed. The Ethiopian tradition is meaningful and deeply rooted, but rests on later narrative developments rather than contemporaneous reportage. Claims of miraculous preservation or modern rediscovery remain at this point unverified. Importantly, none of these conclusions diminishes the central point that the Ark was and remains a powerful symbol. Whether it survives behind a locked door in Aksum, in a Babylonian treasury long since emptied, or as a memory embedded in liturgy and literature, its disappearance has shaped the religious imaginations and political narratives of many communities. What the Ark story teaches us today. There is a lesson here about how objects and stories interact. Material culture can anchor identity, narratives can keep memory alive, political events can scatter or transform material anchors of faith. The Ark sits at that intersection. Its disappearance invites us not simply to search for a lost artifact, but to ask how communities remember, how they construct authority, and how the past is used to sustain present claims.
If you're curious to explore further, I've collected a short reading list and primary sources in the description. Everything from accessible overviews of biblical archaeology to studies of the Egyptian bark, to editions and translations of 2nd Maccabees, the relevant rabbinic passages, and the Kebra Nagast. I'd love to hear which theory you find most convincing. Do you lean toward concealment, conquest and loss, the Ethiopian claim, or a more symbolic reading? Leave your thoughts in the comments and check the description for the bibliography and related videos if you want to dig deeper.